Okay, continue. All right. Um, okay. Well, we know this is not an endgame. Although, after the queen's off, we have a middle game without queens, and some kids will think it's an endgame, and that would be incorrect. Um, so we know about the crash course in key squares. We know about that. We know about key squares for the rook pawn, which I used to save a game the other day. We know how to squeeze a person out from in front of our pawn. There's a simple rule with pawns and the 7th rank, or reaching the 8th rank. A simple rule to remember is if the pawn can reach the 7th rank without giving check, then you will promote the pawn. This is with king and pawn versus king, and you're trying to get control of the queening square. All right, what else do we need to know or review? Let's see. I'm soon going to share my screen and then everything will be good. Do any of you have any endgames you have questions about that maybe we could review if you want? No? Okay, no problem. Okay, what did we cover last week? The idea of having the opposition is to lose it at a favorable time. Okay, so before I go on, I will share my screen. There we go. Okay, all of you should see that. Good. Okay. All right. So a word about the idea of the opposition, distant opposition out and outflanking. And we looked at the close of the lesson, white to play and win, with king and rook versus king, with you only winning by moving the rook once. This illustrated outflanking. And then in lesson 2, we went to a short introduction to planning in the endgame. And our first position was this one. Oops. Where is it? Oh, it's loading. Position 1 was this one here. And what we did is we were trying to find a plan. And what one does in the ending is they attack weak pawns or they attack a structure. So the other thing you're trying to do, or the other objective that you're trying to do in the endgame, is promote your pawns or attack the opponent's structure. I think in this ending that we looked at, we found out that it's going to be difficult to exchange the rooks, because if you do, then black will quickly move forward, and or white will quickly move forward and exchange the one pawn by playing f3 and g4. And so the only point that you can attack effectively is the f2 square. And it seems that the only way to win is by sacrificing the bishop and infiltrating with the king. And so came up with a plan involving placing the black rook at f5 and moving the king forward and sacrificing on f2, and after the rook captures, we just move our king so that it can attack the rook and force a favorable pawn exchange, and then win the g-pawn and subsequently the game. Let's see if I can find it here. Okay. Let's see. We looked at rook e5. We looked at g5. And where is position 1? Okay. So, what did we do here? What did you do? King f2, king e5, rook g2, king d4. So we skipped ahead to all right, I guess I'll try using the board editor. Where is it? So we don't want that. Don't want that. Don't want that. Okay, so we'll go to the board editor. Set up the following position. I think Sean put it, Mr. Wu put it in here, but I can't seem to find it. So the board editor is setting up. I'm going to set up the following position, and we can discuss how we win there. It's a kind of a trick here. So realizing that we have to move forward in this endgame by attacking the f2 square. Black could have set himself up for the following position. First, we'll clear the board, and then we'll set up the following position here. For white, pawn here, and a pawn here, and king here. And for black, and a rook on a2. So black apparently can force this following position here. I won't let me finish. We got a bishop at c5, and a rook at f5, and pawns here, and pawn here, and the king on d3. And it's black to move. Now, this is the only way forward for black. And what he has to do is black to play. He plays bishop takes f2, away. All right, so what has to happen here is he takes. Now notice he takes with the bishop, because you could do the same simplification by first taking the pawn with the rook. But this is inaccurate, because after this, you're not able to approach the pawns. Okay, so that is why you take with f2 first. So we go here, put this guy here, and we put this guy here, put the king here, put the pawn here, put the rook here. So we take with the bishop first, and after rook takes, because you don't take, then you just lose pawns and everything's good. Now this is the crucial point. If you take with the rook, then the king comes up, and again, you are not able to approach, because this king obviously guards this square. So what we do first is we capitalize on the pin by playing king here. So rook just took, so we put the king there. And unfortunately, he has to exchange. And now this leads to a favorable situation, because endgame, Zugzwang is going to force the king away from the pawn, or he will soon lose contact with the pawn, and as a result of that, we'll win the knight's pawn and then the rook pawn and have 2 pawns up. And so we win this endgame because we exchange material for a favorable transposition or change in the pawn structure. So what happens is, after the Zugzwang is forced, so you have to put your king here, and then you win by this Zugzwang method. And what's nice is these 2 pawns here, pincering this square, prevent king h3 and a subsequent g4. So what will happen is, the king will want to hold on to the pawn for as long as possible. So we'll go here, and then here, and then here, and then here, and then here. And now the nice point of having these 2 pawns here, because you can go here and force him to destroy his position via Zugzwang. And then this is a simple win now, right? Because with protected passed pawns, you can always wait for the king to move away from them and then win by force. So king will go over here, and of course, all right, we know that if you go this way, then the king will go to, this king will move to f2. And then as soon as you go behind the pawn, then he'll pull the pawn down the board and queen, and you won't be able to queen your pawn before the g pawn becomes a queen. So we looked at that position, and we discovered that by exchanging material at a favorable, or making a favorable exchange, you win the pawn ending. And this is an example of attacking a vulnerable point and changing the structure. We then went on to look at position number 2. Can you guys hear me? The conversation. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, you can hear me, obviously. I just wonder why this thing is wheel of time is spinning here. Just shut it off. There we go. All right, we'll go back to the study per se. Then what we're going to do is go back to the main study and look at position 2. And position 2 featured a situation where we had knights and rook versus 2 rooks. And we had even pawn material. But the 2 minor pieces were a stronger combination, but you had to go about breaking down, you had to go about breaking down the following structure here, okay, which featured this. And so we decided, or after some reasoning, we found that the vulnerable point would be the G6 square here. And we also noted that exchanging a pair of rooks would not be good for white. And this is why Larson, this position here comes from Larson versus Marjanovic from Bled 1979. White was to play. White has a material advantage, but what should he be doing? Black's pawn structure at the moment is very solid and restricts the white knights. F7 is a potential point of attack, if we can get there. White has enough material in this situation to mount an attack on the king, so black has to be careful that he doesn't weaken his structure in such a way that the knights can approach with the help of the rook and create a mating attack. This might arise, incidentally, by having a pawn at h5 and a pawn at g5, and then a knight somehow arriving at this f5 square. I don't know. Oh, it won't let me do diagonals, or at least long diagonals. Anyway, if you play h5 and the pawn goes to g5, after the knight secures itself, the f5 square will become a vulnerable point. Yet, if you don't move the g pawn after h5, then a possible increase in pressure with a rook landing on the 6th rank and going laterally will force an exchange that will open the f5 square and weaken the structure considerably. Larson is thought avoided h5 because he was worried about the initiation. He avoided h5. He avoided this because he was worried that black would keep his solid structure, leave the pawn at g6, shift the rook here, shift the rook here, and initiate a pin along this rank. Remember that black is interested in exchanging a pair of rooks. White is not. He wants to keep his play coordinating piece, the rook, on the board. And black wants to exchange the play coordinating piece, in this case the rook. And so Larson was worried that rook a3 would set up pressure against the b3 pawn and force him into a passive position. For example, after rook a3, this knight could be brought back to defend against the pressure that would be exerted along the rank. But of course, placing the knight at d4 would considerably lessen the prospects that white has for attacking the structure at g6. The problem being that the d file would be blocked and the knights would be passive. And Larson was worried that a3 would, rook a3 would interfere with his plans. Now, the next position that we are going to look at is this one here. Position number 3. Not position number 5, position number 3. Okay. If we look at this position here, we find that white is up a pawn. We notice that right away. We also should notice that the bishops are of opposite colors, and this gives a position distinct drawing possibilities, largely because of the fact that both bishops cannot oppose each other and help with the advance of the pawns, or by move the pawns forward by threatening exchanges. White has also a pawn plus, and it's passed a pawn, which is firmly blockaded by the a2 or a7 bishop. And black has his own passed pawn on h6, which means that the king and possibly the bishop can't go too far away. Also, should the white king take off, in order to should the white king try and take off, to help the pawn promote and win the bishop, black can initiate a favorable pawn exchange by playing f4, and after pawn takes pawn and a possible king takes pawn, the f2 pawn would be seriously weak. Now, white could say change the structure and put his pawns on f3 and possibly e4, so he could attempt to possibly change the structure and arrange for a passed pawn. But in situations in the endgame, one important rule to remember is to exchange pieces and not pawns, right? Because if you can get rid of the pawns, then you eliminate the queening threat. So it's not possible for white to send his king off to support the advance of the a pawn. So this position looks rather drawish, but let's make some other observations. He has no real targets. Attacking the f5 pawn, for example, you can attack the f5 pawn twice, placing the bishop either here or here, and putting the king on e6. This will obviously force the pawn to move or to be lost. But as soon as said before, if you send the king, let's actually see how would we send the king to e6. Well, first of all, we would go here, then we would go here, then we can't go here to d4. So we'd have to go here. And already black can initiate a favorable pawn exchange here. We could say ignore it, but then our f2 pawn would perish. So it seems difficult to send the king to e6. And even if black fooled around it, let us put the king on e6, he could still play f4 at a favorable moment, and after an exchange of pawns, the f2 pawn would again be vulnerable. So white must queen a pawn to win the position. Moving up to d7 to force through the a pawn suggests itself, but white cannot afford to lose his e and f pawns. So what's the correct plan. The correct plan is to use the 2 versus 1 majority on the E and F files to create an additional passed pawn, then attempt to queen one of these pawns. This is the only possible winning idea. So what we want to do is we want to put the king here, put the king here. Well, maybe just the king to E2, put the pawn on F3, which allows us to move to E4, and then move the king to support this advance and play E4. Threatening E5, but we don't want to do this EF thing. We would rather him do F takes E. So we arrange for, okay, king E2, he does something, I don't know, suppose he keeps his king in the central post. So he goes here. And then we go here. Then he goes here. In the event that he plays F4, we're obviously not interested in taking this pawn. Taking this pawn would be a blunder. But this would fall in with our plan of what's our plan. Our plan is to put this here. Okay, so here's what we've done is we made our bishop bad, right? However, one rule to remember, and another rule to guide you in endgames, especially endgames with bishops, is to put your pawns in the middle game. You want to put your pawns on squares the same color as the enemy's remaining bishop, so that you can restrict its movement. Whereas in the endgame, what you want to do is you want to, at least in this particular situation, you want to put your pieces on your pawns on the light squares so the bishop has no targets to attack. The purpose of this being is the pawn's safety. Having done this, you can now attempt to send the king over here, threatening infiltration and winning the bishop. Black will have two responses. He'll probably attempt to, if your king goes too far, he will attempt to come in and win your pawns. However, this attempt can be easily dealt with by placing the bishop here. What this will do is guard this pawn and prevent the advance of this pawn here. Once that's done, Black will have no counterplay but to move his bishop back and forth along this diagonal or this diagonal, or an attempt to move his king to keep the white king away. So things could go like, for example, so after F4, we'll play E4. And he'll play King E5. Okay. We'll play, all right, so the pawn now wants to come here. I suppose the pawn should go here because if we're left alone, before we send our king on this march, what we're going to do is we're going to secure ourselves against the A pawn queening threat. If the pawn gets to H4 and the bishop's stuck on this diagonal here, then it might be difficult to protect our pawn once the king comes into E3, supposing we've sent our king over here. So what we're going to do first is ensure that we don't have this problem of the H pawn advancing. So that's why white or black should put the pawn on H5 right away so that he can tie down the bishop to this diagonal here. Because what white wants to do is get his bishop here. If he can get his bishop here, then the pawn can't advance, and this pawn is secure, and then the king can go on his journey. So let's see how that might develop. So after king e5, say we play bishop h3. Go directly for our pawn. Plays h5, saying, okay, dude, if you go around, then I will get down here. And I'll force you, through the queening threat, to keep your king from being able to go off, because now you'll have to stay around and guard against my possible queening. So that's why h5. So the bishop takes off here to force the pawn to advance. And we play king in here. What this does is says, you know what? You're going to have to take the long way around to get around my king. And that'll give me enough time to come in here. And since you can't guard this pawn by bishop g4, you're going to lose the pawn. However, interestingly enough, white has another possibility. As soon as the king moves to here, to e3, for example. Okay, how would we get that? Let's put this king here, for example. And we'll put this in here. White has another possibility, and that's a pretty deadly one. And that's of advancing this pawn here. So we're saying, go ahead, take this, we don't care, right? Because the queening threat that comes from our e pawn means that you are not going to be able to deal with both pawns. First of all, your bishop is tied to the a7 square, so our pawn can easily go on to the dark squares, and if you take it, then the a pawn will clear. So what that means is that it's rather difficult for white or black to hold the white king at bay by threatening an attack on the f3 pawn. So these are just some general considerations that you can keep in mind when you're calculating what you're going to do in case your opponent goes after a particular course of action, in this case, taking out the f3 pawn. Now, you might say, well, hold on, dude. After we advance this pawn, he's going to take this. And then queen his own pawn. Right? He's going to play king here. We'll play e7. He'll play f3. And he'll play e8 queen. And then we'll play f2. And have serious threats of queening. Excuse me. The problem is this bishop will be easily able to come to f1 and take care of that queening threat. And the h-pawn is too far away to present any serious problems in its own regard to queening. So that's the only possible plan, is to put our pawns on light squares and then threaten to march our king to b5 and c6 and infiltrate and hit the bishop and lift the blockade. That's the only winning attempt. If we don't try that, then we're not going to make any progress at all. Next, we'll look at this position that comes from Hawkins versus Short. This is a more complicated situation. This is position number 4. And here we find that, let's take stock here. We have 2 and 3 is 5 versus 4 and 1 is 5. So pawn material is even. What do we notice? We notice that its bishops of opposite colors again. We notice that white's pawns on the king side and the queen side are pretty secure. We notice that there's some possible action against the king with a pin. We should also notice about the mobility of our pawns. With the situation here, with this pawn and these 2 pawns, we have a situation where this pawn here, holds back 2. He holds back 2 in the following manner by blockading here and threatening a capture here. So the queenside pawns are not very mobile. What this means, these white's pawns are not mobile. White's pawns are performing a strong restrictive action, meaning they're controlling the light squares. So that means that it might be also hard for black to advance his majority, but he can do so with b5, and after pawn takes pawn, for example, and pawn takes pawn, he will have a 2 pawns to 1 majority on the queen side, which he can use to create a passed pawn. So black has the possibility of creating his own passed pawn. What else is going on here? These 2 pawns on a3 and h3 are pretty secure, and so that means that the white king is pretty well free to go where he wants on to the queen side, but it's not clear how he's going to get past this bishop in order to threaten to move something forward. Another interesting idea is to put the king over onto a3. I'll get rid of this mate. And threaten to play b4. Why would he do that? Well, after pawn takes pawn and king takes pawn, so b4, pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn, we have a possibility of king infiltration towards the base of the structure over here. I want you guys to also be aware of another important principle in endgames. There's no need to hurry. So repeating moves is a good way to find out what your opponent might do. Of course, since you're attending this endgame class, you know, if your opponent starts to repeat moves, you can repeat moves as well and see if he's really trying to win or not. But you're not supposed to hurry. So you can take your time in the realization of your plan. So one other thing you need to consider is, when should I hurry? It's when your opponent threatens to initiate his own plan that would generate significant counterplay or sufficient counterplay. Next question, well, how do I know if my opponent's plan is going to generate sufficient counterplay? The way you could consider that is, the way you could answer that question is by asking yourself, well, let's imagine what my opponent's strongest position would be, his ideal position, and then ask ourselves, is this really a threat? So one of the possibilities that might occur is black attacking white structure when the king gets all the way over here. he plays d4 and says, you know what, I'm going to eliminate some pawns. First of all, there's a pin on the d file, so that move would have to be prepared. We notice also that should this king initiate this plan, black could just simply move his king here, and because of the fact that the bishop guards the c3 square, there's no check. So with a king on c3, he would be supporting the pawn's advance to d4, as well as getting out of the pin, and the king here would prevent this advance because there would be two units guarding this square here. So it's not easy for white to take advantage of the fact that his king side is secure, and he might try and infiltrate with his king on the queen side. Black's active plan is also going to center around attacking the one pawn that's on e3, which he can attack twice by placing his rook on the e file and then maneuvering the bishop around to attack the e3 pawn. What would happen there is the pawn would be forced to move forward, and then it's possible, depending on what the timing of this maneuver, bishop d8, bishop b6, he would be able to possibly play d4 and create his own pass pawn on the in the center. All right, here's what the author has to say. Jonathan Hawkins has to say. Black has more of a choice at this time. Black can clearly create a passed pawn on the c-file, either simply by c5 and c4, or b5 and capturing on a4. Can Black attack the white structure? At first it seems he can, but not very effectively. Perhaps maybe by moving king c5, king b4, or maybe some piece pressure against the e3 pawn. The idea played in the game, rook a8, rook a6, rook b6. So this is the maneuver that Hawkins chose. And what does this do? What this does is take direct advantage of the backwardness of the pawn on b3. The pawn on a5 fixes the pawn on b3 as a potential target. So who can attack it? Well, my rook and king. It's hard for my king to do anything to this pawn. But once my rook gets putting pressure on that, then I can maybe move the rook to b3 and threaten, or rook to b4 and threaten some sort of attacks along the rank. The idea played in the game was rook a8, rook a6, rook b6, attacking the weakness at b3. It's interesting to note how the white rook is short of moves as regards to how it can defend this pawn and keep itself active. He says, it seems likely that Black will be able to improve his pieces sufficiently to put significant pressure on the white pawn weaknesses, but not enough to win the weak pawns outright. The additional plan of creating a passed pawn on the c-file remains in the position and can be used in conjunction with the pressure. So what this explanation by Hawkins shows us is that you should make your least committal improving moves first, right? So you note the characteristics of the position. First of all, the h pawn can't advance. The f pawn can advance, but only leads to a weakening of the white pawn structure on the king side. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. So yes, white can create two passed pawns on the king side, on the f and h files. but how to lift the blockade and how to move the pawns forward, since the bishop, guards the h4 square and blockades the f pawn. So the bishop at f6 is excellent, uh, doing an excellent job of preventing white's counterplay on the king side. So what Hawkins's explanation of what to do with the rook tells us is we should make our least committal moves first. Pawn moves are committal. That's the end of it. You can't take them back. So we look and say, okay, characteristics of this position say that white's bishop on b4 isn't very effective at the moment in creating threats, nor is it possible for the bishop to perform a defensive function with regards to the b3 pawn. It's not possible for the same bishop at g4 to go and easily attack the base of white's pawn chain at b7, because, first of all, it can't go to c8, and when it does go to c8, the rook will arrive at b6 just in time to protect the pawn. And once it gets to b4, the pawn will be adequately protected, and then he can consider advancing the pawn to b5 and creating a pass pawn. So this is key. When both ideas are possible, use both resources, attacking the structure and pushing past pawns. Okay, we have a question. Okay, Jeffrey, thank you. No, don't be sorry. The lesson is recorded, so you'll be able to find it in the Calgary Chess School database that Mr. Wu will create, and you can go look at it there. All right, Jeffrey. Bye-bye. So if you have two ideas, it's very hard to advance your position when you only have one idea. As we saw in the previous diagram, there was only one idea, but it was a pretty potentially effective one. And that idea was to place our pawns on light squares and then go and attack the bishop and use the possibility of creating two passed pawns in order to stretch the resources of both sides, of the weaker side. Here we have two workable ideas, that of tying our opponent down to defense and then creating a passed pawn. So it's important to note what the characteristics are, take account of what the characteristics are in a particular situation, and then see if you can use both ideas. All right, let's look at position number 5. Position number 5 come on. Okay. What we're going to do here is play a little bit of a game. Don't be analyzing this on your computer. It doesn't help if we do that. Okay, what do I want? Okay, good. Okay. This position comes from Nakamura as white versus Sergei Kubrin is black. This was played in the era of, or this century, 2004. So there was no YouTube streamers around at that time, so over the board tournaments were the only thing available. And I'd like you guys to point out what's going on in this particular position before we actually get to see what Hawkins has to say about it. So what do you notice about this position in particular? You can just send your answers to me in the chat as to what you think is going on. Just direct message me rather than, blurting out, in the general audience. Don't unmute yourself, but send me your assessment of what factors might be in play here. What do you notice? Is white to play? White to play. What should white be looking for here? So you have to notice the characteristics of the position and then go from there. Okay. All right. That's good. Somebody said something. Oh, excellent, Jesse. Thank you. That's Black's bishop is useless in the sense that it's performing a purely defensive function, guarding the c5 pawn. Okay, good. What else? Well, white has potential queening threat. Also, we notice. No, I'll let you guys have a look. There's a lot going on here in a relative sense from white's point of view. One of them is that Black's bishop is purely defensive, having to play guard on the c5 pawn. Well, maybe you can approach this a different way. What would be white's ideal position? Well, okay. Assuming that Black won't let you queen the b pawn, or will do all he can to stop you from queening the b pawn, what would a desirable position be for white? Maybe having the king on c6 and the bishop on e7. And then we could take off the c5 pawn. But of course, if we think about that, that would be very hard to achieve, because sure, we can get the king off b6 with bishop d8, for example, and then what? We get the king goes to b7, and then we can't do anything. And when we put our king on d5 and put the bishop back on e7, for example, then black will put his king back on b6. So it's true we can put two people against the pawn at c5, but black has enough resources to hold on to this pawn. Another idea might be to try and checkmate the black king, put the white king on b8 and the black king on the white bishop on d8, and that would be a nice checkmate. Unfortunately, once we put our king on b8, then we'll get checked, and we'll have to put aside that idea. Another idea that white might have, as soon as he puts his king on d7, threatening to go to c8, maybe we'll move our king and prevent him from going to c8 and deal with a potential bishop check. So mating the king seems a bit unrealizable or unachievable at the moment. Maybe there's another idea. Maybe we can put our king at a4 and put the bishop on a5. And once we lift that blockade that way, maybe we can shift the bishop and then try and infiltrate with our king. So maybe putting the king on a4, checking the king from d8 and trying to infiltrate on a5 might be something. But it seems that the black bishop will check us from the e1 a5 diagonal and prevent our infiltration there. But maybe there's another plan, just to put our king at a4, put our bishop at d8, move the pawn to b6, and put our king on b5. That might be a possibility. Ah, okay, somebody has come up with an idea. Oh, thank you, Allison. Maybe some contributions to what we're doing. Anyway, tournament starts in 5 minutes. Guys, make sure that you enter the tournament. You should do so now. Direct message from Jesse. Okay. Oh. No, I didn't want to send Jesse a message. Thank you, Allison. Sean, if you could put the tournament link in the chat there, that would be good.
Sure. I'll do that now.
Any more suggestions as to what to do? Surely, with the combined brain power of 12 people here, or 11 people, we can come up with something.
Yeah, actually, just for this kind of tournament, it's very important that don't use engine to analysis.
Yeah, don't you guys are not helping yourself by going to the chicken run and
analyze. Yeah. Otherwise, it's useless if you know the first or several moves, and then that's just a waste of time. But this one is quite even, so should be fine.
Okay. It's hard to know what we're doing, but what to be going for. But the point is that we have a material advantage. The bishops are of the same color. Black's bishop is performing a purely defensive role vis-a-vis the pawns. One should note that it's hard to activate the black king to go after the white pawn on c4 because of the queening threat that occurs once the king gets to b4. But it seems also difficult for our king to infiltrate beyond d5. So we'll need to use zugzwang in a clever way in order to put pressure on the black position. All right, here's what Hawkins has to say. If white can flush out the black king with bishop d8 while controlling the b7 square with his king, he may be able to push the pawn through. Push the b pawn through. However, this cannot be forced, as white cannot prevent black from putting his king on b7 and leaving it there if he wants. We quickly realize that an attack against the c5 pawn is the correct plan. The evaluation is completely dependent on whether or not white can win this pawn. He certainly can't win the c5 pawn in any trivial direct way, but some patterns may suggest themselves. Also, one thing is you can offer an exchange of bishops because any pure pawn ending is one for the king, for the white. The specifics must be worked on, but the plan of attack and win of the c pawn is white's strategy. And that takes us to the end of thinking techniques and into lesson 3 next week. Thank you very much, and let's get to the tournament, which I will go to right now. I'll stop the share. And I'll go to the chat and go to the tournament. Good luck, everybody.